Hello, and welcome to this session on the revival of the journal we all know as scholarly editing. My name is Noelle Baker. Before we begin, however, I'd like to say a quick word in my capacity as chair of the program committee. In a few minutes, my colleagues will be talking about the invisible infrastructure of the journal. And I'd like to say a word about the similarly invisible support that is enabling this conference. The following are the people who are providing technical support, social media monitoring and communications, and backup moderation for the conference in no formal order. Sharon Kilzer, Laura Fetting, Eric Johnson, Kelly Highland, Michael Cohen, Katie Blizzard, Catherine Garrett, Felix Harcourt, Mary Jo Klein, Samantha Chang, Amy Larrabee-Kotz, David Nolan, Nick Westmoen, Chris Brick, Sarah Martin, and the staff of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Erica Kavanaugh. On behalf of attendees and participants, I thank you for your generosity. A little bit about logistics. Please feel free to add questions and comments in the Q&A function. Our backup moderator will convey them to the panelists and to me. Questions can be submitted at any time, not just at the end. And to let you know, this session is being recorded. Now I'd like to introduce my colleagues. Robert Reiter is the managing editor of Scholarly Editing. He is a faculty member in the University of Alabama's School of Library and Information Studies. He coordinates the school's archival studies program and teaches courses in archival studies and book history. Catherine Tomaszek is co-editor-in-chief. She is professor of history at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. She has written about women and gender in 19th century intentional communities, utopia in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and the use of TEI in digital scholarly editions of 19th century account books. She has been PI on awards from the Office of Digital Humanities, the NEH, and the German Research Federation, as well as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the NHPRC. She is currently chair of the executive board of the Text Encoding Initiative. Raf Bilianti is technical editor. He is a research programmer at MIT, where he contributes to several digitization and text encoding projects with a focus on data modeling and user interface development. Raf holds a PhD in digital musicology from the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and his research is grounded in digital humanities and textual scholarship, where text includes musical notation. Raf is currently an elected member of the Text Encoding Initiative Technical Council. And now, on to our presentation. Catherine?
Hi, I put my notes in a different, I'm really sorry. I put my notes in a different file. And so what I need to do while I'm setting up this screen sharing is plug in my different.
Sounds good, Catherine.
Plug in my different monitor. I beg your pardon.
No biggie. We're all just getting ready. It's a Saturday morning.
There we are. I am super sorry.
No worries, Catherine.
Oops. And that, can you still see my screen?
I can see the screen.
The slide screen?
Yes.
Sorry, let me just, okay. I beg your pardon.
You're doing well.
All right. So here is the slide screen, and also not the way I need to do it. Please excuse me.
You're okay.
All right. You've seen the first slide. Thanks, Noelle. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. We're really looking forward to talking to you about the work that we've been doing over the past 2 years. In our roles as co-editors-in-chief, Noelle and I are planning to carry on the excellent work of Amanda Gailey and Andrew Jewell, who pioneered the online iteration of a print journal, scholarly documentary editing, that began as a newsletter in 1979. The most recent issue of the journal was published in 2017, and we are currently about halfway through the process of producing a new issue, volume 39, in, well, this year. Before the pandemic, here we are, we had planned to present a report about the revival of scholarly editing at ADE 2020. And since we've spent the last year continuing that work, we're very pleased to speak to you here at ADE 2021. We want to let you know that for several years at conferences and from colleagues, we had heard how much the journal had been missed, particularly since it occupied a unique space in the field where people could publish micro or small scale editions without extensive technical support or funding in a home institution that was sustainable. We're enormously grateful to ADE Publications Director, Sylvia Glick, for having begun this process and for offering valuable advice as we've undertaken what has been a significant set of tasks, invisible tasks, as Noelle says, even before the pandemic. Much of the work we've been doing has been invisible, as is all too often the case with publication of any kind. As only one example, I would note that we always credit Amanda and Andy for work on the previous iteration of the online journal. And we don't say anything about the work of Karen Dalziel at the Center for Research in the Humanities at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who was the journal's first technical editor who built the original iteration of scholarly editing. Similarly, we don't mention the copy editor, whose name is Lona Dearmont. Invisible labor fits with the larger theme of this presentation, and in fact of the current iteration of the journal overall, in which we seek to foreground both academic and community work on recovery of documents created by marginalized and underrepresented groups who have developed their own spaces distant from and perhaps unfamiliar to some of the longstanding constituencies of the ADE. Some examples of such spaces include Black code studies, Black digital humanities, and even Indigenous social media, which I ran across today on Twitter. As we noted in our call for contributions to volume 39, we seek to explore the contexts of knowledge production as theorized by Dr. Rubika Rassam in New Digital Worlds, Postcolonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy. Central questions include exploring how projects are designed, how, quoting here, how material in them is framed, and how data in them is managed, and what forms of labor are being used to create them. That's the end of the quote. Dr. Rassam is one of the leading theorists of recovery work in the internet at the international level. You may have noticed the attention received by her most recent book, The Black Digital Atlantic. So many publications in such a short time. As you know, Dr. Rassam is the keynote speaker for our conference. Her address is scheduled for July 6th. Next slide. As we began the process of reviving the journal, we were very much aware that Andrew Jewell and Amanda Gailey had been enormously overburdened, and by 2017 were unable to continue publishing the journal. We addressed the challenges in part by expanding the number of editors from 3 to 9, and by paying particular attention to succession planning. In addition to maintaining the previous iteration's essay section, review section, and microeditions section, we added a pedagogy section and a special section entitled Voices and Perspectives that will include conversations and interviews from diverse groups of people engaging in recovery work. We hope this section will attract K through 12 educators, interested laypersons, and public historians. The reviews section has expanded beyond reviews of letterpress volumes to include reviews of digital humanities projects and digital tools that enable recovery. This screenshot from our journal website shows our expanded editorial structure. As I mentioned, ADE Director of Publications, Sylvia Glick, initiated this reboot, enlisting Noelle Baker and me as editors-in-chief, with managing editor and section editors drawn from the 2019 ADE Publications Committee. We recruited technical editor Raf Filianti, who in turn recruited assistant technical editor Rocio Mendez. Noelle and I have also recruited an active advisory board, so extensive that their names won't fit on a single slide. The emphasis here is on the word active, and we chose this word specifically in response to difficulties faced by the previous editors. When we invited people to join the advisory board, we asked for 3 commitments. First, service for a 5-year term. Second, a promise during their term to review at least 2 submissions of manuscripts or editions that are appropriate matches to their areas of expertise. And finally, a commitment to submit at least 1 article, edition, or review during their term. Noelle and I are also employing a 5-year strategic plan to enlarge the scope of the journal and to consolidate its workflows and practices. One of our long-term goals is to increase the discoverability of content and the reach of the journal's audience, and I'll say more about this later. With regard to succession planning, we're working towards ensuring smooth transitions in year 5, when I will step down, and we plan to bring on a new co-editor to work with Noelle before she steps away the following year. Succession planning is really important. At this point, we want you to hear from 2 of the people who do some of the more invisible work of the journal. Raf currently combines responsibility, as Noelle has said, for the technical infrastructure of the journal and for working with editors to develop microeditions. He joins me here today with managing editor Bob Ryder, and Bob's is one of the new roles that we've added to the editorial team. We brought him in specifically to organize and document workflows, and we've designed his position also to facilitate succession planning, which I'm not going to stop talking about. I'm going to see if I can give you a better slide view while Raf talks to you for a bit.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So I would like to talk a little bit about the decisions that we've made when creating a new website for the Scholarly Editing Journal. And I will inevitably get a little bit technical. So my apologies if things sounds a little bit complex, or if I'm oversimplifying them and they seem a little obvious. But I think that there are a few things about the decisions that we made that are worth highlighting, and that I would like to share with you. So the principles of the guiding idea when creating the new website was to make sure that it would be they will be sustainable for the long term as much as possible. When we inherited the old website, we immediately encountered the difficulties of sort of dealing with a website that was built in a very sort of custom way, specifically to the ideas of the previous editors, which did a great job and created a very unique journal, an online journal, but at the same time created ad hoc solutions that turned out to be difficult to sort of move into a next iteration. So that was very important for us, even though thanks to their help, we were able to create an archived version of the previous journal, which is fully accessible now and integrated into our system. Could you move to the next slide, please, Catherine? Catherine, are you able to move to the next slide, please?
Yes, sorry, working on it. There we are.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, so as I said, our goal was to make the public website of the journal accessible for as long as possible into the future. And the approach that we took to do this was to create a website with minimal hosting requirements. When I say hosting, I mean, essentially placing the website somewhere on a server, typically, so that it can be accessed by the public. So that kind of hosting can have different complexities associated with it, and we wanted to keep it as simple as possible, as minimal as possible, so that it can be easily archived and moved from one hosting service to another without having to set up complex environments each time. So for example, if we were to move from our current hosting service to a different one, we want to make sure that that transition is as simple as possible to do. Essentially, in order to achieve these, the approach is to try and reduce digital infrastructure as much as possible. So you may be familiar with, for example, web publishing tools such as WordPress, or maybe you've heard of things like Drupal and other systems that tend to have to be built around server-side components such as databases or content management systems, user management systems. Every time that one needs to move that infrastructure that is complex, all of that needs to be sort of recreated and reproduced on a different server. And the idea here was to try and create a website that does not rely on those more complex technologies and instead uses what's called a static website. And I'll get back to that in the next few slides. And another way that we thought would be ideal for aiding sustainability in the long term is to rely exclusively on free and open source technologies so that they are constantly accessible and free into the future. And partly these, even though these technical decisions were motivated, primarily by the practical reasons that I've attempted to describe, they're also somehow informed and inspired by minimal computing principles that is a sort of a philosophy, perhaps, or that result in sort of a set of methodologies and ideas that is being taking some footing in digital humanities lately. And here I have a few quotes from Alex Gill at Columbia University, who's been one of the main proponents of this approach to digital humanities work. And so he defines minimal computing as computing done under some set of significant constraints of hardware, software, education, network capacity, power, or other factors. It essentially is, thinking about what happens when you want to do something like digital humanities, which requires computing, but there are limitations that you would be faced with, hardware, software, education, etc. And by engaging with these limitations, it becomes an opportunity to also create solutions and approaches that will be able to give voice to underfunded and represented groups that may be facing constantly with these kind of limitations, especially in power representation, etc. And essentially, the question that guides software development done according to minimal computing is to think about the question, what do we need? So identifying those minimal requirements and trying to stick to those to keep things as simple as possible. Next slide, please, Catherine. Okay. So here I just wanted to reiterate briefly this idea of what web hosting is and how complex it may be. So I'm getting a little lettery here perhaps, but just to sort of clarify the fact that when we access websites, we typically send a request of some sort to a server, and that actually has the data of the website that is then sent to us to be displayed in our browsers, on our phones, on our computers, etc. And a lot really can happen on that server side, on that infrastructure, depending on the complexity of the site. And I mentioned earlier things like databases, user management system, etc. All of that infrastructure and computation is not on your computer, it's somewhere else, it's managed and hosted somewhere else. And it's really the responsibility of the website maintainers to make sure that that keeps working into the future. What minimal computing in general tends to prefer when doing digital publishing is to try and remove as much of that complexity as possible, is to make sure that there isn't a lot of work that happens on the server, but the complexity is really not there, so that it is easier to move around, store, and distribute and archive and keep into the future. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one approach to this is to utilize static websites that are essentially only made of files that your browser can display directly. Relying on this kind of technology makes websites particularly resilient because they can be stored and transferred just like regular files. So kind of like, PDF documents or other documents that you may have on your computer. Imagine a collection of those that are able to work within the browser and can be more simply moved around. So the server essentially is only working as a file distribution system, and that's the simplest operation that a server can do, really. And this makes them particularly suited to minimal computing projects that include digital publications. And you might have heard of things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. These are basic web technologies that your browser knows how to operate. So essentially, what we have created for the scholarly editing website is a static site that is only made of these components, so that is as sustainable as possible. Next slide, please. So I'm going to mention a few names of technologies here. I will not get into too much detail, however, but I want to make sure to mention them so that you can Google them, or if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them later and expand on the specific solutions that we came up with. But for now, I'm just going to sort of give a very quick overview. And essentially, for the content of the website, which is articles, the microeditions that we are curating, as well as archived issues from the previous iteration of the website, we are relying on something that is called the static site generator, which helps us, deal with the complexities of creating the content, and then it sort of outputs, it creates that kind of static website that I described in the previous slide. And the technology that we're using for this is called Gatsby. And that's the big G that you see there. And the results of the static website that gets generated is hosted on a platform called GitLab, which allows us to collaborate on the material, as well as provide that basic function of simply distributing the website, the files of the static site to make them available and accessible via URL. So when you go to scholarlyediting.org, you are essentially talking with GitLab that sends the files back to your browser, and then the browser does the hard work of displaying it, essentially. But our operations are not limited to the website. There's more that needs to happen and needs to be supported by technical infrastructure, and I'm thinking in particular about the submission and review process. And for that, we are using OJS, the Open Journal System, I believe it's called, which is a very well-known system for managing academic journals. This is one of those typical, more complex websites with databases and user management, etc. That is being hosted by a company called Reclaim Hosting that offers us a place where to put this. In this case, we are relying on this kind of infrastructure to facilitate our process, but at least from my point of view, it is less important to make sure that this system continues in perpetuity, right? While the sort of public facing website is the one that I really want to see accessible for the really long term. Even though there is a lot of very important information that is happening on OJS, it is not public facing. So the priority of preservation is different. And we're also counting on Reclaim hosting for some of the larger assets. So for example, large images and things like that are actually grabbed from Reclaim hosting servers rather than from GitLab. Again, they're not backed by any complex system. They're just grabbed directly as images. Next slide, please. The microeditions are kind of a special case because they are a lot more complex in the way they work compared to a regular article or essay. And in fact, it's one of the things, in my opinion, that really distinguished scholarly editing journal in its previous iteration from other similar journals. The fact that it offered the possibility of creating digital editions, on a small scale, and offered a place of publication for that kind of work. So we are continuing that in this new iteration, but we want to do it in a way that is conformant with the minimal computing principles and sustainable infrastructure that I've described so far. We still use TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, which is a standard for encoding text, as well as editorial work. So it provides essentially a language for describing both a text that is transcribed and the operation of transcribing, like what are the findings that the editors have made on this work on a certain document, or what decisions have they made. There's a language for sort of describing all of these operations, and then building a publication based on that information that is encoded. And typically, traditionally, TI has needed complex infrastructure in order to create digital publications, but with latest web technology, it is possible to do it in a more minimal way. So we are using fairly experimental technology here in order to carry out this work and be able to make it work together with our Gatsby environment and static website. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop here. I'm very happy to expand on the details, on the technical details of this decision. So if you have more questions about the motivations for it, I'm happy to return to it later. Thank you. I think perhaps Bob is next.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to speak with all of you this afternoon and discuss some of our work in developing workflows that govern the journal's operations. So in this section, I'll briefly discuss overarching principles, which have really governed the journal's approach to developing, the necessary core practices, along with how those practices are performed, and then discuss specific examples of those workflows and documentation. Now, first sort of a, general, definitional point is, when we're, discussing workflows of the journal, we're really concerned with, what are the core practices, associated with, necessary core practices associated with the operations of a high quality peer reviewed journal, but perhaps more importantly, how those practices are expressed. In terms of how discussion takes place, how various editorial units collaborate with one another, and really how the journal engages with a constituency. Really in terms of in many ways, the workflows we've developed are a direct extension of the mission statement, where the mission statement is a concrete statement of goals and objectives, the nature of sort of the academic, scholarly community, editing community that it hopes to support. And then the idea of the workflows are, how do we develop mechanisms that aid the journal in meeting those stated goals and objectives? The workflows also extend from policy documentation. The journal has very clear statements on ethics, statements on diversity and anti-racism, peer review ethics. And again, to sort of, echo, Catherine's earlier comments related to, invisible labor, it's not that, this is the journal's operations are an extension of earlier best practices developed by past editors, as well as our colleagues at leading journals like the Reviews and the Digital Humanities, which have really established, best practices for how do you really intentionally build kind of a, ethical values into the operations of a journal, particularly in how it engages with communities and really supports, the publication of, diverse content. So in terms of, again, general principles, again, it's another expression of invisible infrastructure, like technical infrastructure, and really conceive of it as supporting internal operations, but then also engagement with external constituencies. A strong aspect that really informs, all of the overarching policy documentation. And as I'll note later on, sort of the approach to developing content is thinking as the journal as sort of this anchor site and supporting, communities of practice. And so, the mission of the statement is to reach, a broad, diverse set of communities of practice. So we've been very intentional in devising procedures which help us to ensure that we are, reaching a broad constituency, but then also building assessment mechanisms into what we're doing. So again, some examples of these, which I'll describe in greater depth from the next slide, are, mechanisms for internal and external communication, more basic elements just to ensure that, there are clear lines of communication between the co-editors in chief, the managing editors, the section editors, contributors that contact the journal with questions regarding submissions, how we interact with contributors once they've submitted pieces, standards and policies for content development. I think a critical point is that we've developed workflows in a way in that every action is guided by documentation and every action generates documentation. One, because thinking in terms of succession planning, we want to ensure that there is a body of evidence that future contributors to the operations of the journal can rely on, but also that we have sort of a body of evidence for sort of self-assessment at the end of publication with each volume. For example, if we hope to, for example, solicit content in a given subject area, if we found that we didn't really necessarily achieve that goal, we could go back and look at our content development strategies and practices, review the documentation to see what we can do to improve. We've also placed strong emphasis on peer review procedures. As Catherine noted, the journal is complex. It has a number of content areas, and you can't apply sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to peer review. For example, the evaluation metrics for and procedures for evaluating microeditions, for example, is distinct from essays and the pedagogy essays. So though there are sort of overall standards of that must be met, we've also built flexibility into it to support peer reviewers. The peer review process, which includes also supporting peer reviews. Again, sort of with the theme of sort of cultivating a community of practice. When we discuss, again, part of our workflow documentation is statement of ethics, we also have statement of ethics regarding the peer review, to ensure that, contributors, are provided with concrete, constructive feedback, which aids them in their work. And then lastly, sort of the other critical category of workflows is engagement with readers, because again, we've envisioned, and sort of conceptualized the relaunch of the journal as sort of this hub and anchor site for supporting, communities of practice associated with the journal's areas. And so again, there are procedures for how we ensure that the content is widely disseminated. How a broad constituency is reached. And as we've said before too, these policies are grounded by overarching documentation, a mission statement, statement on diversity and anti-racism, statement on ethics. Again, because the main goal really is sort of these overarching goals the journal sets. How do we build an internal infrastructure that allows all of the team members to effectively meet their goals, and the journal to effectively operate? I think another important point that again, sort of continuing with the idea of self-assessment is a critical principle of workflow. The workflows that we're ending with are, slightly different from where we began, as we sort of understood, not challenges, but different sort of operational, procedures that emerged over time, areas where we felt, more, defined, stricter workflows were required, more precise guidelines would be needed. So we're very much sort of, these workflows have been codified over the year with input from all members of the editorial team, members of the advisory board, informed by recommendations from contributors in terms of how elements could be more clear to support them in submitting work to the journal. So again, I think this is sort of a critical theme when we think of workflow. It's sort of a a community development activity, including content that was brought in from Noelle and Catherine's listening tours, that occurred earlier in the year. Catherine, can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So that refers to sort of the general overall principles of the workflows, because again, we want to be really clear, sort of drawing on sort of ideas from a sort of social study of science, sort of ideas of sort of values in design. We really wanted to ensure that sort of the journal's values clearly articulated in the mission statement, is really what informed how the journal engages with others. So in terms of, operations and procedures, what is it that needs to be governed and defined? What are these workflows? These can really be categorized and divided into four main categories. The first is governance policies, the relationship between the executive editorial team and the section editors. How is information circulated? Where, when a piece is submitted, where does the initial review begin? For example, there's, beginning with sort of desk review, culminating in peer review. So there's sort of overarching procedures which govern how the journal operates, defines, clearly delineates, responsibilities. The second category is communications. And this is really the concern with, ensuring policies governing standards for communicating with external constituencies. One sort of, ensuring, basic level, ensuring that all communications are clear and concise, but then also too ensuring that, we are reaching a broad constituency. And again, even though here, many of these categories, blur with one another, they're sort of delineated here separately. But for example, communications, ties into, developing communities of contributors and readers, as I'll discuss. But, we're very much focused on communications, in ensuring that that we engage a broad constituency and that we can communicate with contributors and potential contributors in a clear and concise manner. The third workflow, and this is perhaps, this is really critical and fundamental to the journalist, standards for developing communities of contributors and readers. And I think, again, this is communities and readers is a really important element. Yes, we're concerned with, cultivating an audience of individuals that sort of view scholarly editing as a venue for their work, but we're also concerned with helping to establish a rich readership, perhaps, outside of the domains of perhaps, traditional, the traditional readerships of scholarly editing. And this is where the section editors are very important. And the critical responsibility of the section editors is really to serve and support content development. And two workflow elements are the content development plan and the outreach strategic plan. Beginning with, and this is an element that emerged over the course of the year, and beginning with, issue 40, in advance of the, shortly after the call, all the section editors submit a report to the co-editors in chief, stating how are they going to, what is their strategic plan for developing audience of contributors that aligns with the mission statement, that aligns with the statement on diversity and anti-racism, and then translate that into an outreach strategic plan. So this ends up as a written document or report which clearly indicates, venues to solicit specific individuals to reach out to, and each section editor then submits a monthly report, providing a progress update on the content development plan, on the outreach strategic plan. And again, the goal is that each month, we can assess, and even at the outset, we can evaluate the initial development plans and strategic plans to show, okay, what interventions are needed to ensure that the workflow, the practices of engaging with the community of our external constituencies aligns with the mission and goals of the journal. Now, the last category of workflows is the peer review procedures. And again, we're concerned with, again, maintaining, high quality, high standards, rigorous peer review process, while being also hospitable to, distinct modes of academic practice. I think a critical aspect of the journal is this sort of research inclusivity. Research takes many forms. So I think it's something that and again, sort of the way in which you evaluate a pedagogy essay is distinct from how a piece submitted to the general essay section, might be evaluated. So we've been careful to ensure that there are, nuanced procedures that ensure that, again, that contributors and their work is evaluated fairly in line with high standards, but sort of reflective of the nature of the content. So the peer review process, there are 4 general steps. There's an initial desk review to illustrate, to evaluate that the piece meets all of the necessary standards, followed by a review by the co-editors in chief to further evaluate the extent to which the piece aligns with the journal's mission, the call, and also that it aligns with sort of the general submission standards. And then after pieces are determined that they'll be sent out for peer review, there's consultation with the section editors where appropriate peer reviewers are developed, and then the pieces are sent out for double-blind peer review. Each piece is evaluated by 2 reviewers. And again, very careful, again, sort of there's an ethics statement for peer review, ensuring that the pieces are evaluated by individuals that have the necessary, subject expertise of the specific, of the content. And again, this is sort of a critical aspect of it. Again, ensuring that, we want the peer review process, particularly in cases where, it might not necessarily be a positive outcome from the author's perspective. We want to ensure that we are providing constructive feedback that encourages someone to resubmit work to scholarly editing and that helps them to continue to develop as a researcher and contributor. So this generally describes sort of these 4 categories align with the 4 main categories of the journal, sort of the core essential operations, necessary for its day-to-day operations, the communications activities associated with engagement with communities, sort of the community building facets of the journal, and then lastly, the tasks associated with ensuring the evaluation and publication of high quality content and informative content that benefits our communities of readers. And again, I'm happy to address any specific questions in the question and answer period. And this was meant to sort of provide a general overview of core principles and selected examples of the main categories of workflows and associated documentation. And I'll now return the presentation to my colleague, Catherine.
Always have to find the button that looks like a dog biscuit. Thank you both, Raph and Bob, for explaining some of the things that we just don't always think about when we think about the labor, the real work that goes into producing a journal. I'm going to talk now about our call for contributions, and within the context of facilitating recovery of documents by marginalized and underrepresented groups. So as we planned our first call for contributions, our executive editorial team worked from a set of considerations that echoes and expands on concerns that have actually been part of the field since the 1970s. I find myself fascinated to be referencing the 70s, since I was not a professional at that time. But Connie's comments at the president's panel on Thursday illuminated some of these issues as she discussed her early work on the Booker T. Washington papers beginning in 1979. And in fact, some of you may have read an article published by Jesse Lemish a few years earlier in 1971. So this article was called The American Revolution Bicentennial and the Papers of Great White Men. And Lemish proposed that 20 years after its establishment, the body that was then known as the National Historical Publications Commission was, and this is quoting Lemish, in some ways already an anachronism, a relic of the 50s. That's the end of that quote. Lemish was a member of the American Historical Association's Committee on the Commemoration of the American Bicentennial, and he published an abridged version of a report he had researched and written for the committee. Lemish excoriated the NHPC for working from what he called an exclusionary perspective that left out, quoting, Blacks, women, and Indians. At the time, these were, as one might expect, fighting words. A full 50 years later, it is 2021, the field has evolved to some degree. Distinguished members of ADE undertook and completed projects focused on such influential women of the Revolutionary era as Dolly Madison and the women of the Pinckney family. The papers of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is now a venerable project. The larger professional organizations to which most editors in the US belong, the AHA and the MLA, have created guidelines for evaluating digital scholarship by historians and literary scholars. And the MLA Committee on Scholarly Editions has called for greater attention to the recovery of documents created by people from marginalized and underrepresented groups, as well as on projects that decenter the single author focus that often emerged from the field's nearly exclusive attention to canonical and well-known historical figures. As we heard from Daryl Meadows yesterday, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, that's its current name, has initiated a program that will offer startup grants for collaborative digital editions in African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, and Native American history. This is welcome news. We sought to speak to these more recent developments in the field, both when we created a new section of the journal focused on pedagogy and when we wrote our call for contributions. And this screenshot, which I realize you can't read, I apologize, but we have a very pretty journal website. Our senior editorial team shaped our call for contributions in a way that we hoped would elicit microeditions that would broaden the scope of the journal, moving us away from a focus on elite editions and bringing in examples that would reflect the contemporary international flavor of both scholarly editing and academic projects focused on the recovery of historically marginalized communities and voices in Europe and North America, as well as the global South. We have been very pleased with preliminary results. This discussion of our call leads me to the question of contexts for scholarly editing. When Noelle Baker undertook a survey of other journals in the field to determine our journal's role, she noted a number that are published in Europe, where there is, of course, a centuries-long tradition of scholarly editing. And this screenshot, again, I know you can't read it, but this screenshot does show that for the essays section, we included a prompt that references an influential 2016 collection of essays edited by Matthew Driscoll and Elena Pierazzo, Digital Scholarly Editing. Our goal here was to signal the international contexts in which we see the journal. It is very important to us to make sure that the journal and our constituency are in dialogue with as full a range of practitioners as possible. To this purpose, in addition to the general call for contributions, the executive editors initiated a new space for special sections that we hope will offer our audiences a sense of the breadth of projects and practices that are part of the capacious fields that we seek to reflect and encourage in scholarly editing. One is reflected in this screenshot that may be more legible, I don't know. We're pleased to report that this additional call for brief reflections on experiences in the field has yielded several essay-length submissions. As I mentioned previously, another section of interviews with editors and other recovery groups engaged in long-term projects is part of what we're including here. This is called Voices and Perspectives. In volume 39, we will feature Sylvia Glick's interview with Walter Earl Fluker, editor of the Howard Thurman papers, as well as Katie Blizzard's exchange with Deborah McDowell, editor of the Julian Bond papers. We expect to have at least one additional interview for either this issue or the next. Having worked hard to cultivate submissions, we were thrilled to receive a strong set of essays from an international array of authors for volume 39, which we will publish this fall. We expect to publish 5 microeditions per issue with a similar number of general essays, pedagogical pieces, and reviews. That's 5 for each section. And the call for contributions to volume 40 should be live after July 4th, next week. Oh my goodness. Discovery has a number of meanings with respect to scholarly journals. One of these comes from the field of libraries and archives, and we're very fortunate to have a professional from that field on our executive editorial team. In addition to his work implementing systems to manage editorial workflows, Bob Ryder has been attending to indexing as a way to facilitate discovery by researchers who may be unfamiliar with scholarly editing. Of particular interest here is the work he has done to register the journal through the directory of open access journals. In a less technical sense, we've also sought to extend the transparency of scholarly editing by introducing our pedagogical section and by undertaking a search for organic community partners. We hope to find other means of creating discoverability for people outside the academy and for K-12 educators and students. Another part of our outreach includes offering presentations at a number of conferences in addition to this one. Raf and I presented a version of this talk as part of the Digital Humanities Summer Institute conference earlier this month. We've organized a session focused on spaces for publishing small editions for the upcoming triennial meeting of the Society for the Study of American Women Writers. And Noelle and Raf, at least, if not Raf and me, Bob and me too, who will be presenting at the MLA in January. Our final 2 slides, you must be tired of hearing us talk by this point. Our final 2 slides quote the journal's mission statement and our statement on diversity and anti-racism. And I apologize, I understand that the text is small. You can find these on the journal website at scholarlyediting.org. These 2 statements, the mission statement and the statement on diversity and anti-racism, reflect our intention to amplify underrepresented and racialized voices and works within the field, within the content of the journal, and within our advisory and editorial boards. It's very important to us to get across the message that we welcome scholars and educators from historically underrepresented and racialized groups and peoples, as well as all those who have expertise in the histories and literatures of those groups and peoples. Importantly, our message is meant to be inclusive. We welcome all those who are custodians of knowledge, both within and outside of the academy. And this is just our little final slide, which says, thank you. So I'll stop the screen sharing now.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And now we can open up for questions from those who are attending. And Bob, I see one from Connie Schultz that is really very much linked to what Catherine has just been talking to us about. Connie says, question for all, but related to Bob Ryder's comments on communication and outreach. Scholars, students, and editors I know often think first of JSTOR or other consolidators and indexers of publications when seeking relevant information and scholarship. Will scholarly editing be included in those resources? If not, what are any stumbling blocks that might prevent doing so?
Thank you. No, that's a good question. Yes, this is, we have sort of a running list of, we've been submitting the journal for approval to be indexed by the major databases, and then also to sort of more informal aggregators that sort of list relevant journals. And this is a spot where an area where we would recommend, where we would welcome contributions from all of you. Are there any specific databases that you use in your work? Are there any aggregators, resource aggregators that you're aware of? And you could, my email address is listed on the Scholarly Editing website. You could forward those to me, and then we'll see that requests are submitted. The main stumbling block is whether the venue is approved, whether it's approved for inclusion in the database in terms of relevance. But we welcome any recommendations for all of you, because again, the main goal is, how do we amplify the journal?
I just noted, Noelle, that I can add something about how JSTOR works if folks are interested. Sometime back, maybe it was in the aughts. This makes me feel ancient, but I'm getting more and more ancient by the day. Ithaca, what is a sort of think tanky kind of thing, that has something to do with JSTOR, had a Mellon-funded conference that I attended, and one of the things that I asked was why, for instance, it took so long for the Journal of Women's History to be part of JSTOR. And part of the answer that I got from, I think his name is Rob Schneiderman, was, well, we do the important stuff first. So I think there's definitely advocacy to be done if we want scholarly editing to appear as something that is indexed in JSTOR. And I really hope Bob can help us with that.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and we are getting another question about workflow, which is directed for any member of the panel, but Bob may be best suited. What models did you consult in developing new policies and workflows for the journal? Are there particular journals you consider to be good models? And I'll say quickly that yes, we did. The answer is yes. As Catherine mentioned, I conducted a really fairly capacious review of both of ethical policies that are being developed as well as other journals. And Bob can tell you more about that.
Sure. No, I think definitely reviews in the digital humanities, particularly in the policies related to ethics and just sort of centering sort of the ethical values of the journal was really instrumental. And then just the scholarly editing, the existing documentation was very helpful. I mean, there were clear guidelines and policies for peer review. So I would say it was sort of using historically a strong framework that was already in place, but then sort of looking to other journals. I think particularly were very effectively sort of centered ethical values within the documentation. But I think reviews in the digital humanities is definitely one that we recommend that folks consult.
That's absolutely right. And I think maybe Ralph wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, just very briefly, that from a technical perspective, there are a number of online academic journals, and I use as a reference in particular the Programming Historian, which is not quite a journal, but it contains peer-reviewed tutorials for digital humanities, and they have a similar technical stack that I took large inspiration from, since they are a successful example of this approach.
It is also the case that there are numerous sites that list best practices in the publication of scholarly journals, and Noelle was really instrumental in finding a lot of those.
Yeah, we've tried throughout, and this is one reason why it's taken us a full year to really get going, is that we tried to be as deliberate as possible. And we're still trying to be deliberate, as Bob mentioned, in terms of self-assessment. And as Catherine likes to say, that we're all always learning. And I think that is informing all of our work moving forward for the journal. I see another question that's come in. Can you give some examples of types of projects and submissions you would like to publish in the future? That's a good one. We're always looking, we're particularly interested, as Catherine mentioned, and as Bob mentioned, in underrepresented and racialized groups. And those sorts of contributions are the ones that we'd like to highlight for the journal. And whether it's original source material, whether it's essays on that material, whether it's teaching strategies for such material, we welcome all of that. We are, as Catherine mentioned, we will be expanding our editorial board to meet different fields of expertise, and also we would like very much to expand to a public humanities focus, and that includes K through 12. And one of the editorial positions that we would like to bring in, at least one for the next volume, volume 40, is a K through 12 editor, at least one person of that sort. Catherine, do you want to add something? And Raf, you may want to add something about microeditions. I don't know.
I don't have anything particular to add. I think I want it to be clear to the membership that that we don't mean to be exclusionary. We don't mean to say, oh, you can never send us anything that is about the Revolutionary era. We're happy to receive submissions that we will send through the review process, and that will go through rigorous review.
We're particularly interested too in really putting forward the microeditions, because that's one of the comments that I heard anecdotally when, after 2017, when I was delivering papers at conferences, that people would just be saying, what happened to scholarly editing? We would love to publish this small scale edition or recovery project, and there really aren't as many venues available to do so. Unless you have a lot of funding and support, it's often very difficult to publish a recovery project that is sustainable. And that's one of the features that we feel, and that RAF has worked very hard to make a reality, is that we want to produce recovery work that is not going to go away. It's not going to be a broken link. It is actually going to be available for scholars and for students and educators and laypersons and community members for a very long time. And that's some of the value we think we can add to people's work. And we're actively always looking for those kinds of contributions. So I have another question. I think it's worth mentioning that the previous iteration of scholarly editing had an excellent and unique TEI to HTML-born digital workflow. Could you say a little more about how scholarly editing is going to work with and enhance TEI projects in this next iteration? New features, new interfaces. I say this as someone who thinks that digital editions are still needlessly complicated to publish, so I think scholarly editing could fill that void.
Yeah, very happy to answer this question. Yes, I agree. The previous iteration of scholarly editing was excellent from many different points of view, including the technical one. And I've definitely been one of those people asking at conferences what happened to scholarly editing as a journal, because it was, for me, like a go-to example when talking about like the digital editions done well. So definitely the idea is to try and to replicate that standard, but will we be using different technologies? And my hope, and I'm still in the middle of finding these out as I start working with editors this summer, is that these set of tools that we're going to be using can actually simplify the process and empower the editors to do more technical work on their own, essentially by relying on static site technologies like HTML, CSS, etc. I'm making it possible for editors, for example, to use something like CSS, which is a styling language that is relatively simple to pick up, to style the TI directly without having to really transform it into HTML. And I'm hoping that will take us, 80% of the way in for a lot of our editions, and then, there will be inevitably slightly more complex situations for, maybe editions that include textual variants or specific textual phenomena that the editors are interested in encoding and having displayed in a certain way. So for more complex aspects, I essentially will be stepping in and taking on that work in a way similar to what I know anecdotally the previous editor, the previous technical editor did as well. But that turned out to be, it's complicated to do that work. So the idea is to try and rely on these new technologies to balance the labor a little bit differently this time around. And probably next year, I'd be happy to give you an update on how that went. We're still in the middle of it right now.
One thing I would like to say is that we are really fortunate to have Raf as our technical editor. He and another member of the TEI Council have worked on a really terrific tool called Citation, which I absolutely love the name of, that is about publishing TEI. And Raf is also working on other tools that are for helping our editors of Microeditions. We're just so fortunate to have somebody who knows how to do this kind of important technical work that is so very often invisible. So lifting you up.
Yes, and the next question that we received actually is along these lines, Raf. This is coming from Nicole Livingood. Some of the technical language standards outlined in the Microedition section of the website sound intimidating or overwhelming to a person new to the digital humanities. What kind of support is there along the way, and what needs to be in place even before submission? And then nicely, also thank you to all of you for such deliberate planning and such a helpful and interesting session. And I would just say a quick plug here, anyone who's interested in producing a micro edition, we strongly encourage you to reach out to any one of us. And what we are regularly doing already is meeting with people who would like to propose, to talk to them about the process, about what they might need. So don't just blind send in a proposal, talk to us first, and we'd be delighted to do so. But Raf, go on with this question.
Yes, I mean, that's it. The only thing I would add is that as a result of, talking with potential contributors even before the submission deadline, we now have, a fairly wide range of technical expertise in our editors. So we're working with some who, have not worked on digital editions at all before, and others with plenty of expertise. So yeah, the key really is to get in touch soon, so that we can explain what kind of work is involved, but also the collaboration is intentionally flexible. So, the idea is that we'll help as much as help is needed, or step away as much as the editors want us to sort of step away.
Yeah, and I'd add to that as well, that we've even had multiple meetings with some groups, and maybe some people who are at the very, very initial phases of really even conceiving of their project and talking through with us, well, does this seem like a good focus, or should I select this sort of document? And so really we welcome people at all stages of your project. We very much want to be part of however much you need us to be helpful for. So what I would really say is that I fully understand that the technical language can sound intimidating, but if you have a passion to recover something, just talk to us and we'll work with you and help it become a reality. And it will be a reality for a long time. It won't go away. So that's something that we really believe, to the extent that you can with a technical situation, that we can guarantee.
Mhm.
So, sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to echo that. Go ahead.
I don't think we have any more questions. I don't know if others want to add anything, any final words about the journal or the process. Bob, do you want to add anything?
I guess just to echo Connie Schultz's earlier question, if there are any resources or venues where you think the journal should be listed, tools that you commonly use, or even to listservs or organizations that you're a member of that you think we should reach, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And again, because we're very much concerned with positioning the journal in a way that can, best help, the associated communities of readerships and potential contributors.
Absolutely. And I had another thought, just going back to Catherine's point about welcoming a variety of content. We also very much welcome anti-colonial perspectives and interpretations of texts traditionally conceived. So we do have a kind of a two-pronged approach. And I think that if you read carefully both our statement on anti-racism and diversity and our mission statement, I think you can see the scope of projects and content that we hope to support and amplify. So with that, I think we have 1 minute remaining. So I think I will wish you farewell and thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session.